Well, these exact people I just said were liars, propagandists, on the tape, couldn't be trusted. All of a sudden, they were infallible. Whatever they told me, it was like divinely inspired. They must be right. It's foreign policy. They must be. We're going to get the bad guys. And so I more or less held that view for a long time, and I can see that there might be a problem with that kind of naivete. I was so critical in one area and so utterly credulous in another. Now, we need to recall some of the important advice given to us by the Founding Fathers. People give a lot of lip service to the Founding Fathers. That's better than nothing, I suppose. But when it comes to the issue of war, it's especially important to recall their advice. James Madison, in particular, spoke a great deal about this. But if we were to summarize what they had to say about it, it was to caution us that war leads to debts and taxes and increasing government secrecy and expansion of government power and centralization of power, especially in the hands of the president. This is not something that limited government people should favor, so therefore, it shouldn't simply be a throwaway line to say that war is the last resort. For example, in World War I, when the United States finally decided to intervene in World War I, the left liberals were all in favor of this. There's this myth that the left is anti-war. That's absolutely false. The left was overwhelmingly in favor of intervention in World War I. The number of exceptions to that, you could count on one hand. Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, a few others. The outright socialists were against it. But one of the reasons that the progressives were overwhelmingly in favor of getting involved in World War I was because they knew it would expand government power. They knew it would. In fact, if you look, it's in the years of World War I that the New Republic magazine was founded. Now, the New Republic is a terrible magazine. It's I don't know if it's worse now than it was then. I don't know how to compare two horrible things. But I don't know if you've seen the New Republic. Some of the younger people in this audience, because of the internet, have never even heard of the New Republic. I'm so delighted to live in a world where people have never heard of the New Republic. But those of you who have been around like I have for a while, you know this is a terrible publication. Well, they got started during the years of World War I, and they are so excited about intervening. Because we got to look at the German bad guys, but mainly because then we're going to have government central planning of the economy. We're going to have more and more resources coming under the direction of the federal government, and the people, we will be able to move them away from their stupid, superstitious attachment to the sanctity of private property. Never again will they believe something so primitive. So, again, that should make you pause. Well, wait a minute, how come the progressives are so much in favor of this? And again, I think sometimes, I know when I was a young conservative, I just felt like on principle, whatever the liberals favor, I do the opposite. I don't even have to look into it, I do the opposite. But that's not like we're above that. So in fact, the establishment left, I'm not talking about the hard left, they've always been a very, very tiny minority. The establishment left supported all the major wars. I mean, you go from the Spanish-American War, the left was all for that. And continue into the world wars, even into the Cold War. The establishment left was all in favor of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and yes, Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy were part of the establishment left. And they absolutely supported that, as did all the respectables. And then going into the Persian Gulf War, you look at, count up how many major American newspapers wrote anti-war editorials. You could count them on one hand. You could probably count them on an amputated hand. The establishment is in favor of these policies. And then you go down to the 19th, it just carries on. So it is not true that, well, I'm sticking it to the left by being pro. No, I mean, the left turned against the Vietnam War when it seemed like it was hurting the government's image. Then they said that they want to change their position. But by and large, they were in favor. And in fact, the really hard left has always looked at war as having great revolutionary potential. So here I quote my favorite conservative sociologist, and I just want to say that because when else am I going to get to say that? Sociologist. Robert Nisbet, who wrote as follows. He said, Napoleon was the perfect example of revolution as well as of war, not merely in France, but throughout almost all of Europe and even beyond. Marx and Engels were both keen students of war, profoundly appreciative of its properties with respect to large-scale institutional change. From Trotsky and his Red Army down to Mao and Zhou Enlai in China, the uniform of the soldier has been the uniform of the revolutionist. He goes on to say that war is about the least conservative thing there is when you think of its effects on traditional, custom-based societies. There's a great book on the history of the conservative movement by a guy named George Nash. It's got the worst title I've ever heard. The title is The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. That is terrible. That's such a nightmare. It's terrible. But in that book, he sort of subdivides the conservative movement. He says, well, we have the libertarians, we have the anti-communists, we have the traditionalists, so there's obviously a lot of homework here. But what I found interesting is he says the three most significant traditionalist conservatives of the post-war period were Robert Nisbet, the guy I just quoted you, Richard Weaver, just a fantastic scholar, and Russell Kirk. Now, Russell Kirk is sort of considered to be like maybe the founder of American conservatives. He wrote a classic book in the mid-50s called, or I think 1953, called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. And that's gone through, I don't know how many reprintings, 118,000, I don't know, a lot of reprintings, this book by Kirk. And yet, when you look at all three of these people, they are not enthusiastic about military intervention, precisely because they understand it to be an anti-conservative force. I think of, I don't know if I should mention his name, but there's a well-known commentator who in the early 2000s said, well, I think it's time for us to pick up some crummy little country and throw it against a wall just to show we're serious. I say, I can't imagine a dignified conservative talking that. Like a conservative doesn't talk. Right? That's a degeneration of conservatives. Likewise, somebody joking and singing about bombing Iran. Like any conservative with any dignity at all should have immediately denounced this. And unfortunately, I didn't hear anything like that. So that Andrew Bacevich, who is one of these traditional old-timey pre-neocon conservatives. Andrew Bacevich is a West Point graduate, served 23 years in the U.S. Army, and calls himself a conservative. And I believe him. He says this: Americans in our own time have fallen prey to militarism, manifesting itself in a romanticized view of soldiers, a tendency to see military power as the truest measure of national greatness, and outsized expectations regarding the efficacy of force. To a degree without precedent in American history, Americans have come to define the nation's strength and well-being in terms of military preparedness, military action, and the fostering of or nostalgia for military ideals. Also, it has become common to hear of all places, conservative circles, outrageously exaggerated rhetoric regarding what is possible with military intervention. These are supposed to be skeptical of what political power can achieve. So, for example, David Frum, a famous speechwriter who coined the term axis of evil, in the 2000s he wrote a book called An End to Evil. Now, conservatives do not talk that way. Conservatives don't talk about an end to evil. Conservatives look at this world and they say, we live in a screwed up world and it's inherently screwed up. And the best we can do is try to carve out some kind of livable existence for ourselves. But the idea that you would even jokingly title a book An End to Evil, that's what you would expect the left to write about. Is we're going to use political power and force around the world to bring about an end to evil. Now that's the sort of thing conservatives in the old days used to just kind of chuckle at. And now this is being put forth as conservative. There's nothing conservative about this. And this type of thinking encourages further devotion to political intervention. Because if the government can put an end to evil around the world, then why do you conservatives say it can't give us affordable housing, for heaven's sake? So unfortunately, it encourages this thinking in terms of what political activity can do. If it can do all this, why can't it plan at home? Why can't we have a planned economy? And as a matter of fact, this was the ideological legacy of World War I, the American involvement in World War I. That when the 1930s came along, and there was the Great Depression, the slogan was, we planned in war, let us plan in peace. And of course, the New Deal gave us years and years and years of the Depression just continuing. Went on longer than any Depression we've ever had. It's the first one where the government said, let's roll up our sleeves and try to fix this. And by interesting coincidence, it happened to go on longer than any one that we've ever had. But notice the ideological legacy of World War I. In 1930s, it was thought, well, we had a planned economy in war, let's plan in peace. And it was thought, we had these various acts that were passed in World War I, let's revive them and use them domestically in the 1930s. So there were institutional and ideological legacies of that intervention. And of course, by the way, fascism gets its birth during wartime. The whole rotten ideology of fascism comes from the idea that, look, during war, we all worked together in a great enterprise. And we all maybe spoke different Italian dialects or something, but we were all shoulder to shoulder fighting this same battle. So now let's bring this same collectivist mentality to organizing domestic society. Let's all come together as one. If this sounds like Hillary Clinton, it should, because that's the way she thinks. And it all derives from the wartime experience. This is not a conservative legacy. Moreover, people become, well, more favorable toward the government if there's a military intervention going on. Well, we better not ask too many questions about what it's spending its money on, whether or not the money is being spent on the military or not. And so the great scholar Robert Higgs puts it this way. He says, during wartime, many people increase their broad support for the government, and hence they are less inclined to challenge its actions, even when those actions have little or nothing to do with the war. Hardly anyone was surprised that real defense spending increased by almost 60% between 2000 and 2007, while real GDP rose by only 18%. Note, however, that the government's real non-defense outlays increased concurrently by more than 24%, an increase one-third greater than that of GDP. When people let their guard down because they support the troops, they permit the government to make greater headway in its ceaseless quest to enlarge its spending in a wide range of areas, many of them strictly civilian in nature. Then we have, of course, some of the economic consequences. It is not true, by the way, that World War II got the economy out of the Great Depression. That's false. No conservative should repeat that because you are handing all the evidence to the stimulus people when you say that. So it's not true. I have a page on that. I'm just saying this to the YouTube audience that has pen and paper. libertyclassroom.com/war is my page on why World War II did not get us out of the Great Depression. I'm not going to cover that now. But in case you were thinking, well, at least war gives a shot in the economy, I am not admitting that because that is not true. It's superficially true. It's not actually true. But there are other less obvious ways that war and even a large military state undermine the economy. One of them is that it makes the economy less competitive in many ways. For example, one thing that firms that get involved in having the Pentagon as a major client discover is that the Pentagon is a unique type of client. It's not the type of client you deal with in the free market where they're going to be constantly concerned about cost, low cost. Now, the Pentagon is concerned about cost to a degree. They don't want to spend like $2 quadrillion on a project. So to some degree, there is a upper bound. But one way or another, they'll get the money. The major concerns on the Pentagon's part are, can you work well with the military community? Can you deal with the fact that we're going to be changing the design on you every 2 days? Are you adaptable? Those are the main concerns. And so what winds up happening, this has been documented case after case, is these firms become deformed. They begin to make decisions they wouldn't make on a free market. They begin to engage in Rube Goldberg type contraptions because they know that, well, one way or another, we're going to get the money. So cost minimizing becomes relatively low on the priority list, but subsidy maximizing becomes much higher. And then these firms can't compete in the free market anymore because their competitors have been dulled. So I'll give a brief example of this. In the machine tool industry, in the 1960s, all the rage was something called numerical control machine tools. And in Germany and Japan, they developed numerical control machine tools that were cheap enough that the civilian economy could use them. But not in the U.S. In the U.S., numerical control machine tool technology was so ridiculously expensive, nobody could use it. And the U.S. began to lose its competitive edge in machine tools. And why was that? Because the main client for machine tools was the Pentagon. and cost maintenance is not the main concern. So the U.S. got totally eclipsed in machine tool production because of that. No one thinks about this when you think about economic cost. Or opportunity costs, research and development people. There are very few people in society smart enough to do the type of research and development that we need for advances in civilian innovations, in civilian uses, and in the military. Very few people are smart enough. So it's not like if the military uses some of these people, well, don't worry, more will pop up. There's a fixed number. And for a long time, between 1 and 2/3 of all research and development talent has been siphoned into the military sphere. That has no cost. You may say, but we get a lot of benefits from it. Well, maybe not. But right now, the U.S. government is spending nearly as much on the military as the entire rest of the world put together, including all the countries that some people feel might be enemies of the U.S. someday. They're not spending all this money. And meanwhile, 40% of the military budget is secret. So the question has to arise about the compatibility of all this with traditional republicanism, small r. Then we have the problem to deal with what's called front loading. Front loading is when some project is dramatically overpromised. This new missile is going to be great in all the things it can do. It'll be stealthy, no one will be able to see it, and it can go all these distances, and it'll be super accurate. And it's going to be so cheap. You're not going to believe how cheap this missile is going to be. It's going to be like $10, this missile. And so the Congress gets sold on this. They say, wow, look at all the features. Look at how cheap it is. Then reality sets in. Once the project is committed and the taxpayer money spigot starts flowing, it becomes very hard to turn it off. And that's when you suddenly hear, well, second thought's not going to be that stealthy. As a matter of fact, we put a giant smiley face on it, so it's not going to be stealthy. And it's not as cheap as we thought. It's going to be $1 billion instead of 20. So, and then also, the enemy it was designed for, meanwhile, no longer exists. So you think, all right, there's every reason in the world to shut this thing down, right? There's no way this should continue. But what they've done, meanwhile, is the second phase, after front loading, political engineering. You make sure that the jobs associated with this project are spread out among as many congressional districts, especially districts with committee chairmen in them, as possible. And then no one will vote to stop. No matter how preposterous it is, it just carries on. Now, I was reluctant to accept this type of reason because I felt like, well, the military is like an exception to the free market. You know, like I shouldn't even worry about waste or whatever. But, you know, there are bad, self-interested people in all areas of life who exactly want to take advantage of a naive like me, who thought, well, I trust those people. You know, this one sector, everybody's going to be kept on a short leash, is my philosophy. Well, then finally, when we look at recent history, you may say, all right, well, this is all nice and theoretical here, but we're facing an enemy and we've got to deal with it. All right, well, look, I've read the history of Islam as much as anybody else has, so it's not like I don't understand what's going on here. But it is worth thinking about on the issue of 9/11, about the attackers and what their motives were. Now, when you raise the question of their motives, you are accused of blaming America. You're blaming America for the attacks, but certainly I'm not. Right? No American was hijacking those planes, so I'm not blaming America. If it turns out that I am critical of U.S. government policy, since when is that America? I sure hope that's not America. That the U.S. government is America? What kind of crazy, horrifying notion is that? That's a left, again, this is a left-wing idea. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea. Conservatives aren't supposed to believe what Jean-Jacques Rousseau believes, that the government is us. We are the government. That is just nonsense, preposterous, right? Okay, try not paying your taxes and say, look, I already paid it because I already am. So even if I am critical of the U.S. government, that means I'm critical of like 24 policymakers. That is not the same thing as America. America is like the Rocky Mountains. You know, the Grand Canyon, that's America. These bozos are not American. But the point is, detectives seek out motives. Why did somebody do something? We don't say to a detective, are you blaming the murdered person for why he was murdered? No. But a detective wants to know why did it happen. Just wouldn't you kind of want to know? you know, these people are just irrational, and it doesn't, they are just have motiveless evil. And so we have to just respond appropriately. But it is worth considering this. The Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in the early 1980s tried to launch a crusade against the United States because of our decadence culturally and our blue jeans and our First Amendment and all that. And it was a complete flop-a-roo. Absolutely no one was interested in doing this. And that's why none of you ever even heard of it. That was it. Well, he gave some speeches and no one rallied. But Bin Laden, the whole point of what he's saying to people is, they are propping up police states in this part of the world. They are occupying our holy place. Now you may say, but we need to prop up police states and occupy our holy place. It also doesn't even matter to me what your position is on that. The point is that if that's being done, this is going to be the cost, and are you willing to bear that cost? That's the sort of question that a cost and benefit analysis conservative would ask. And this is what becomes victorious, not the let's go after them because of their blue jeans. No one's interested in doing that. People do have other lives other than what American women are wearing. And it was this. It was we got to get this intervention out of our countries. Now again, as I say, I've read all the books about Islam that those other people have been. That does not mean that a bull in China shop foreign policy is the best response. The current policy, from every measure I can see, is creating more enemies than it's eliminating. And it's worth noting also, worth remembering, before the United States government decided to involve itself heavily in the Middle East, the United States had an excellent reputation in the Middle East. People think, they're going to hate us no matter what. Well, that's just, I can prove that that's false. In 1920, the King Crane Commission was sent over to Syria to find out which country would the Syrians like to be governed by as a League of Nations mandate. And the overwhelming answer was the United States. Now, of course, that would never happen today. So how have these interventions worked out? We're going to go after radical Islam. How's that worked out? Well, in the mid-1990s, we had John McCain, the 2008 nominee, actually saying that the U.S. should put ground troops into Bosnia and support the Muslim cause in Bosnia. And he favored that, and Clinton's problem, from McCain's point of view, was he wasn't bombing enough on behalf of the Muslim cause. We've got to get down there and get ground troops. So now we've got a situation where the U.S. government actually flew in, actually transported in a great number of radical Mujahideen fighters from Afghanistan to help fight against the Serbs in Bosnia. And then after that was over, they just sort of figured these radical Mujahideen would just go back to their homes. Well, they didn't. They just melted away into the Bosnian population. And then a few years later, we get these intelligence reports saying, well, we have a terrorism problem in Bosnia. Well, you don't say. Like, well, I mean, is this some kind of a news flash? But that was the policy. Or then a few years later in Kosovo, we had a lot of support. Again, we had a lot of Republican support, and certainly the Democrats. Let's bomb Kosovo. Let's bomb the Serbs on behalf of the Albanian Muslims. That would be our interventionist policy. And then after that happens, the Albanian Muslims are burning down Orthodox churches. But no one was paying attention by that point because the people moved on to something else in the news cycle. And that was that. So this is their policy on waging this war. Then we got the war in Iraq about 10 years ago. And so how did that turn out? So we took Saddam Hussein, I don't want to say we, I don't think we did. They took Saddam Hussein, who was a two-bit nobody, no conceivable threat to anybody. He had a drone program, we were told, and he's going to hit people in England in 45 minutes. And it turns out his drone program was a single prototype of plywood and string. But oh my God, now, if you can see through the propaganda of the USDA, you should be able to see through this. Like, this was ridiculous. Who Condoleezza Rice said he's no threat to anybody. Colin Powell said he's no threat to anybody. You got this guy who is a secular guy. You can go get a drink in Saddam's right? Which probably you wouldn't want to do if you were living. But then, what was the result of the war? Well, now we have a government there that swings toward Iran and now has a The real conservatives, the 17 of them who were left, were all predicting this. I can think of a certain congressman who said this is exactly what's going to happen. You're going to wind up with pro No, you're being a leftist to support this war. No, actually, John Kerry supported the war, Hillary Clinton supported the war, Bill Clinton supported the war. All the establishment left was totally on board as usual. So, but actually now, here's what we have. Here's the Deputy Prime Minister around. Quote, the Americans have no role. This was just a couple weeks ago. Nobody listens to them. They lost their power in this country. At the moment, this is an expert on Iran talking now, Iran has something akin to veto power in Iraq. Was that the situation beforehand? No. So, but this is supposed to be, this is what, how many trillions of dollars later? And you were unpatriotic or leftist for thinking that maybe wiping out one of the powers in the area might strengthen the other. Well, but that's the way conservatives used to think. So this is not leftism. To the contrary, the idea that you're going to spread democracy around the world or spread feminism to Iran or feminism to Afghanistan, that's not what the conservatives thought. Conservatives have a more sensible and realistic appraisal of what is possible in this world. Now, Bill Kristol, the founder of the Weekly Standard, calls conservatives to national greatness conservatism. In other words, leftism. He wants us to embrace the principles of Alexander Hamilton, even though Russell Kirk taught us that Alexander Hamilton doesn't even qualify as a conservative. And in particular, they want to do this with regard to Iran, which I'll say just a brief word about. Patrick Cannon had an excellent column about this a few weeks ago. Pat's not a leftist by any standard. And he wants to know, he asks a few, I think, interesting questions. He says, how is America, with thousands of strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, scores of warships in the Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean, bombers and nuclear subs and land-based missiles able to strike an incinerator Iran within half an hour, threatened by Iran? Iran has no missile that can reach us, no air force or navy that would survive the first days of war, no nuclear weapons, no bomb-grade uranium from which to build them. All of our nuclear facilities are under constant United Nations surveillance and inspection. And if this Iran is the greatest national security threat faced by the world's last superpower, why do Iran's nearest neighbors seem so unafraid of her? And then he goes on to point out that so further. Whose major exports, other than oil, are carpets and pistachio nuts. Let's keep a sort of sense of proportion here when proceeding, especially in light of all the other. Then they want to remember the intervention in Libya without really knowing what's going on, and then they want to be in Syria. When half of these people are again radical Islamists, and the very people who are supposed to protect us from radical Islam want to encourage them. It makes me think it's like these interventions have worked out so badly, even on their own terms. It's like they're trying to encourage radical Islam, the neocons, so that then they'll have an excuse to interfere further. That they'll make the situation so bad that they'll make it seem like, oh, we have no choice but to intervene. I don't know how else you could have a policy that yielded you such consistently opposite results from what you're aiming at. Unless you're just really bad, or you're doing this on purpose. I don't know. But on this stuff of where conservatives should be standing on this, where they should not be sucked in by propaganda, I have a page on my site. I do this all the time. TomWoods.com/war. And I put some stuff on what conservatives should be thinking about this stuff. But we should not let ourselves get suckered by people and policies that have been, by any standard, unmitigated disasters, and which have undermined principles that we are supposed to believe in. Conservatives, I leave with this point, have finite goals. They are not seeking world, global, democratic revolution. They don't have this kind of pie-in-the-sky view. This is a leftist view. Conservatives seek after the finite pleasures and values of hearth and home. Not national greatness conservatism, but the principles of the household, the home, local. What's local, limited, and tangible. That's what a conservative cherishes, and that alone is what a true patriot defends.
changing venues now. We're going to have a great time tonight. There's a map on the back of the program showing you how to get out the banks to the Park Farm Winery, where you're going to enjoy some personal time with Tom Woods, have a nice conversation, enjoy a glass of Iowa wine or beer, whatever you like. There'll be food out there too. It's only $50 a person. Come out and help us do events like this. Be a part of it. We want you out there. This has been a fun day. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you. You don't get told that often. Thank you for making a sacrifice of your day and your money to come and be a part of this and hear this message. But we're not finished. Come on out, follow that map, meet us out there. Come and hang out with Tom Woods and the rest of us tonight. We're going to have a great time out there at the wine. So don't miss it.